Serfdom existed in the Russian Empire for several centuries, which was reflected in literature, painting, and even music. Despite this, we still do not fully understand how people lived before the famous decrees of the Tsar liberator Alexander II. While we have at least a general idea about the lives of male serfs, the fate of women remains little understood, and it was unenviable, extremely patriarchal. Customs, domestic violence, daily hard labor, and complete lack of rights in front of the landowner. You will learn about horrors you can't even imagine. It's sad that there were such moments in human history. Sometimes it's embarrassing for us as people. In this episode, we'll talk about how serf women lived, what their status was in the family, and their main responsibilities. And of course, you'll also learn how landowners treated their serf women, about real harems in manor houses, and about the sexual duties that serf girls had to perform for their masters. My name is Simeon, and I declare the How Did They Live the section open. Let's begin. About women in Russian villages. In Tsarist Russia, the serf peasant was at the very bottom of the social pyramid. The landowner could sell him, trade him, send him to Siberia, or simply have him flogged in the stables, for any offense. Serf peasants had virtually no rights. The only social group below them in status was peasant women. From the moment of marriage, a woman fell completely under her husband's authority, often seeing him for the first time only at the bride show. The opinions of the bride and groom about their future marriage interested almost no one. Usually, this issue was decided by the heads of the families. Formally, the landowner had to give permission for the marriage, but as a rule, they did not interfere in such matters. Marriages were usually very early, starting from the age of 14. They tried to marry off a girl to get rid of an extra mouth to feed. This was even called getting the girl off the bread. Girls older than 20 were already considered old and risked never getting married at all. For a peasant girl, marriage was quite a stressful experience, because she had to leave her own family and move into a stranger's house, where she was under the authority of people she didn't know before. That's why the bride's weeping before the wedding was not just a tribute to tradition, but actually a reasonable reaction to the situation. The young daughter-in-law in her new family received a very low status, and she could justify her existence only through hard, relentless work. For the slightest offense, and often just as a precaution, the woman was beaten by her husband, his brothers, or the head of the family. Constant domestic violence was considered the norm, and even the women themselves approved of it. Moreover, men who did not beat their wives were condemned by society and considered weak-willed. Beating women with metal or wooden objects was not approved. In such punishments, the husband was advised to use a whip. However, such leniency was not due to humanitarian considerations, but rather the desire to punish without maiming the woman, so as not to risk limiting her ability to work. After all, even after the punishment, she was still expected to fulfill her household duties. By the way, the church not only failed to protect women from violence in their own homes, but even prescribed mandatory strict physical punishments for any misconduct on their part. Moreover, priests recommended periodically beating a woman for no particular reason, just as a preventive measure. It was believed that through beatings a woman was purified, and if she wasn't beaten, she would inevitably fall into sin. It can also be added that violence in Russian peasant families was generally considered normal. Zemstvo chief Alexander Noviko recalled the word to beat in peasant language. A husband teaches his wife, parents teach their children, and even a son teaches the old man his father, because he has lost his mind. Nowhere will you see such a reign of violence as in a peasant family. Another duty of a peasant woman was to give birth to children. She usually had her first child around the age of 18, and by the age of 40, due to hard labor, illnesses, and constant childbirth, she would become childless. On average, 9 children were born in a peasant family, but of course, some women managed to give birth 15 or even 20 times. However, child mortality was very high. Only about half survived to age 5. People took this calmly. A woman was even allowed to pray for a miscarriage or the death of a child if she already had many children. When it comes to sexual relations, the customs in Russian villages were extremely patriarchal. After marriage, a woman was not even allowed to talk to an unmarried man on the street. A wife was regarded as her husband's property, so there was no question of any sexual relationship with another person. The appalling poverty of the Russian village drove women to commit adultery. Contemporaries recall that peasant women offered themselves for small amounts of money, food, or goods from the city. Oh, it's just terrible. I have to go when I'm a servant. The entire philosophy of the serfdom system, the economic and everyday relationships between landowners and their peasants, served the purpose of providing Paran and his close ones with all the means for a comfortable life. As I already mentioned, the serfs were almost completely dependent on their owner, who could easily turn any of their lives into a real hell. And naturally, the landowners made full use of their power. Forcing women into debauchery was so common in the landowners' estates that some historians even identify a kind of sexual corvée as another obligation for women. Public opinion was absolutely calm about such escapades of the landowners, unless, of course, the libertines completely lost all sense of boundaries. But even in this case, bringing a nobleman to justice by law was extremely difficult. The law enforcement and judicial systems were always on his side. Just remember the story of the famous Saltichika, who tortured several dozen serf peasants. She was brought to justice only because Catherine II found out about this case. Such a powerless position of the peasants often led to uprisings, as a result of which entire noble families sometimes perished. Sometimes the landowners were simply taught a lesson, flogged with whips, or just beaten. Every year, up to several dozen peasant uprisings occurred throughout the Russian Empire. The authorities responded to them with maximum harshness. Participants had their nostrils torn, were beaten half to death, and sent to Siberian penal servitude. Many landowners, who mostly lived in the capital or abroad, would come specifically to their own estates to satisfy their lust with serf women. On the day of arrival, the manager would show the landowner all the girls who had grown up during his absence, after which the landowner would choose the ones he liked. Well, those girls simply couldn't refuse their master. There was even a special proverb about this: "She must go since she is a slave." It often happened that in the estates, all the girls were sent to please the master and his friends. Some nobles even boasted about their exploits. For example, one nobleman in his memoirs openly called himself a rooster and referred to his peasant women, both young and old, as hens. Even worse, the landlords rarely paid any attention to the age of their victims at all. Children were rarely touched, but cases of pedophilia still occurred. Landlords not only satisfied their own lust at the expense of their serfs, but also made quite a business out of them. For example, it was not uncommon for girls to be sent to work in the cities, fully understanding that they would be engaged in prostitution there. Sometimes peasant women were forcibly sent to brothels, and there were even more sophisticated schemes. For example, a widow in St. Petersburg had an estate with a large number of serfs, and every year the most beautiful girls were brought to her from there. For 10 to 12 years, the girls in the widow's house were dressed up, taught manners, dancing, music, and other useful skills, and then at the age of 15 they were left to secular libertines as mistresses. For one such girl, the cunning landowner received up to 500 rubles, which was a huge amount of money at that time. Such customs may seem wild if you don't know the morals of Russian provincial nobility. Wealthy landowners felt like true masters on their land. They were above the law because they had money, connections, and powerful patrons. It was not uncommon for such local tyrants to organize real bandit raids, robbing passers-by on the roads, ruining peasant farms, and attacking the estates of their fellow landowners, committing violence against their relatives in the process. There were many cases when the wife or daughter of a neighboring nobleman ended up as a concubine of an influential landowner, and no one could do anything about it. Not to mention the situation of the serf girls. Many landowners approached the organization of their sexual pleasures and their masters' harems with great ingenuity and thoroughness. They didn't just corrupt peasant girls, but created real harems out of them, which they called serails in the French manner. And their involuntary inhabitants accordingly were called seralkas, in general a harem made up of serf girls. In a noble estate somewhere at the beginning of the 19th century, this was just as much an integral feature of noble life. Like, for example, hound hunting or a card club. Of course, not every landowner had a harem, just as not everyone liked hunting or the card table. However, this phenomenon was extremely widespread. Some people had a small harem on their estate, consisting of 5 or 7 girls. Others kept dozens or even hundreds of concubines. You might ask, why so many? Well, after all, the landowner had friends visiting, he hosted various gatherings, and of course he shared his serf beauties with his guests. Usually the selection of the seraglio as well as their upkeep was handled by the estate manager. If the harem was too large, then a special person was assigned to it. The conditions in which the girls were kept varied, and sometimes they were extremely harsh. To illustrate this, I'll give a few real stories. For example, Prince Gagarin had a modest harem where 7 girls and 2 gypsy women lived. The latter taught the serfs to sing and dance, while the girls were kept in extremely strict conditions. They were even forbidden to look out the windows. For the slightest offense, the Seralik were beaten. However, in the presence of their master, they had to display cheerfulness and joy. Otherwise, they faced severe punishment. General Izmailov also had a harem. He was hospitable and generous, so he kindly offered the girls for the use of his guests. One day, General Izmailov had so many guests that there weren't enough concubines for everyone. Without much hesitation, Izmailov sent people to fetch girls from the neighboring village. Naturally, the local men didn't want to share their wives and daughters with the master and gave his messengers a good beating. After that, Izmailov flew into a rage. A punitive expedition was sent to the village, mercilessly slaughtering the peasants and burning their homes. The story turned out to be scandalous and quite loud. They even tried to open a criminal case against Izmailov, but it was quickly hushed up. This Izmailov apparently was quite a character. He oppressed his serfs in every possible way, kept his concubine girls in terrible conditions, locked up in rooms with bars on the windows, only occasionally allowing them to go for walks. According to his contemporaries, he did all sorts of vile things to the girls, and the age of his victims didn't really matter to the scoundrel. Some landowners approached the creation of a harem creatively. For example, Prince Nikolai Yusupov had all his concubines taught choreography. At first, they would dance in front of the guests. Then, at the host's command, they would take off their clothes and move on to sexual pleasures. Yes, it was a kind of serf striptease. The famous Decembrist Osip Yulian Gorsky also had a harem made up of serf girls. To satisfy his lust, he bought 3 peasant women in the Podolsk province, but he treated them so badly that the girls ran away from him. However, the most vile pervert is considered to be the nobleman Viktor Starshinsky from the Kiev province. Throughout his life, he corrupted or raped more than 500 peasant women. Starshinsky generally regarded his peasants and household serfs as talking cattle, useful only for his comfort and pleasure. For his cruel treatment of the peasants, criminal cases were opened against Starshinsky 4 times, but each time they were swept under the rug, only at the end of his life. The landowner had all his estates taken away from him along with the serfs, and they were placed under guardianship. The sentence for the rapist was personally approved by Emperor Alexander II. But what about love? But what about romantic stories with a happy ending? You might ask, did it ever happen that some count or prince, enchanted by the beauty of a serf girl, bought her out of bondage and then married her? Yes, such stories are known, but they are so rare you can count them on your fingers. The most famous of them is, of course, the marriage of Count Nikolai Sheremetev, one of the richest men in the empire, to his serf Praskovia Zhemchugova. Here, we're not talking about some ordinary servant girl. Zhemchugova was an actress and the main star of the Sheremetev's serf theater. According to the recollections of contemporaries, Praskovia had an amazing voice and a remarkable artistic talent. In addition, the young woman played several musical instruments and was fluent in a couple of European languages. Empress Yekaterina II, impressed by Zhemchugova's performance on stage, personally awarded her a diamond ring, and the count was literally enchanted by his singer. In 1798, he granted her freedom and then secretly married her. The wealthy landowner from Vladimir, Nikolai Nazvanov, married the leading actress of his serf theater. He not only granted his beloved woman her freedom, but also bequeathed all his estates to her in his will. But these cases can be called unique. Members of the high nobility willingly cohabited with serf girls, cared for them, and even had children together, but it was not customary to marry them. It was more often the case that minor, impoverished nobles who owned 50 peasants would marry their own serfs. However, even this was most likely an exception, and society viewed it negatively, considering such a person a violator of tradition. The same Sheremetev, after marrying Jemchugova, was forced to leave high society and settle on his estate. And yet, he was one of the wealthiest people in the empire. A few words in conclusion. It is known that power over people corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. The serfdom system drove the landowners of the Russian Empire to an extreme degree of moral degradation. There could be no other outcome. From early childhood, the future master, observing the lifestyle of his parents, relatives, and neighbors, grew up in an atmosphere of such twisted relationships that all of this undoubtedly broke his psyche. It's clear that nothing good could come from a child raised like that. Centuries of serfdom had a devastating effect on the consciousness of the Russian people, as well as on the consciousness of the Russian elite. And the latter actually suffered even more. Even after the abolition of slavery, the ruling elite of the empire continued to treat ordinary people like cattle. It came back to haunt them in 1917, but that's a completely different story. Well, that's all I have for now. See you in the next episode. Bye.